Hello again, and welcome to the 33rd episode of the podcast, Simple Enlightenment. I'm your host, Dean Graves. We greet you in the love and the light of the one infinite Creator. On June 23, 1990, a fifth-density social memory complex of the archetype law that identifies itself with the name Latwii spoke through a channel, Carla Ruckert McCarty, in response to a group question concerning forgiveness. The following is an excerpt from that communication.
Forgiveness is first the turning to a power greater than yourself, and a giving to that power of an entire situation, that you may be given the consolation and the healing that you require in order to forgive yourself. Whether you are the wronged one or the self-perceived wrongdoer. There is always a lack of forgiveness of the self that seems to be held more tightly than the forgiveness of others. You gaze too close into the mirror of this illusion and your manifestation within it. Your birthright is to be forgiven, to realize each self-perceived error and to forgive oneself for it and move on. Thus, you come to a respect and an honoring and a loving and nurturing of yourself. The key to forgiveness of others is the forgiveness of the self. Release, release, release. Give back to the forces of the universe those energies which are easily absorbed in infinity, and leave them not to pollute your own feelings, your mind, or your heart, but rather let forgiveness flow as a sweet river under the surface of all that you do and say.
Latwii continues.
When the work of forgiveness of self has been done to the point where you feel that maintenance is that which is necessary, rather than complete concentration, then and only then turn to the attempt to forgive others. It is not selfish to do the work upon the self first. It is necessary. It is mandatory. You must bring your own personality and biases into balance. Else, how can you be the house of the Father? How can that light shine through you if you are lurching about, wasting the energy of love in the distortions of self-immolation? Let us say, we have done this work, and it does come to an end. Not that you do not slip from time to time back into those negative programs, which have caused you to be armored against the rest of the world and survive, but that you recognize that you do not need this armor, that you are meant to be vulnerable to circumstance, that you are meant to be an actor upon the social scene. This is the density where you learn to deal with entities in more and more gentle compassion and love. Now you have forgiven yourself. You then can see that although those other entities may not have done this work, at the end of that work, which they will do at some point, they will find their birthright as children of a forgiven nature, children of the one Creator, children of love in which there is no judgment.
Latwii's address is directed towards a third-density audience and uses several references that would have meaning and be identifiable to an earthly population of this level of consciousness, with the intent of providing the recipients with information to promote their healing of distortions that cause them pain and suffering. At the time of this writing and subsequent podcast presentation, the population of the planet is still predominantly third density, but is also significantly comprised of fourth density denizens who may find some of the references archaic. This does not diminish the veracity of the content or the validity of the healing process prescribed. The sum and summary of the excerpt explains that incarnate mind-body spirits tend to harbor resentments against other mind-body spirits, groups, or the whole world in general, for what the resentment holder perceives as one or more transgressions. Some perceived transgressions may be considered small and others deemed large, but regardless of the perceived magnitude of the transgression, the resentment holder has interpreted the catalyst or experience as an unpleasant experience and continues to carry the unfinished emotion and memory of the catalyst because they have refused to become aware of the lesson it offered. In other words, the resentment holder has received a message from another individual, group, or the world in general, which carried a lesson about the recipient, but for whatever reason has declined to learn the lesson. The resentment holder has been given a homework assignment and essentially said, "I don't want to do my homework now." Just because the homework isn't done doesn't relieve the student from the obligation to do the homework and learn the lesson. The homework will remain pending until such time as the student relinquishes his or her resistance and actually completes the assignment by finishing the processing of the experience. Unlike school homework, the lesson to be learned can only be completed by feeling and resolving the emotions that the student created in response to the catalyst. Until the student decides to become aware, explore the self by feeling the emotions, and surrendering its resistance to doing the work of the enlightenment process, the partial emotional interpretation of the experience will be stored inside of the student's energy body as emotional baggage, which then serves as a magnet for future experiences and hinders the student's flow of intelligent energy through the chakra system. Imagine that you decided one Saturday morning that you need a new doghouse for your beloved companion, and you began to build the doghouse but were called away from your task by some less tiresome opportunity, like golf or shopping. To preserve your project, you decide to move the half-finished doghouse into your living room until you could return to it sometime in the future. The next Saturday, resolved to continue with the doghouse project, you decide you've had an idea for an even better doghouse design and begin from scratch to build another doghouse, but you leave the previous half-finished doghouse in the living room. Again, a more enjoyable opportunity arises that distracts from building the new doghouse, and you move the new doghouse project into the living room to be stored next to the previous unfinished doghouse. This routine continues for several weeks until eventually the main house is full of unfinished doghouses, and you can't even navigate through the house because of all of the unfinished projects stored there. The body's energy system is like the main house, and the emotions you have stored in anticipation of returning to finish their processing in the future are the doghouses. In order to reclaim a comfortable dwelling, it is necessary to remove the half-finished doghouses from the main house. Resentments result from experiences with individuals or groups that don't meet the recipient's expectations, which means the recipient didn't get more of what it likes from the experience because the messenger didn't recognize, defend, or support its identity, the false identity that it spent a lifetime engineering so it could get more of what it likes. The size of the slight varies with the degree to which the message recipient's expectations were not met. If you shopped in a store and the clerk was rude or condescending, the resentment formed may be small, but pungent, and may cause you to vow never to return to the store. If a spouse or significant other has an affair, the resulting resentment may be large and instigate a series of significant life changes called divorce, depriving the message recipient of a heretofore significant pillar of support for their false identity. The size of the resentment will vary according to the degree to which the experience bringer has been incorporated into the identity, or, in other words, the degree to which an agency has been established with the person or group. The language used to express the resentment usually indicates the size or intensity of the resentment. For example, betrayal and traitor are very heavy words to identify the catalyst or the person to whom the agency was shared, and usually indicate the intensity of the feelings used to interpret the catalyst's experience. All emotions result from the most simple of analogous choices of either it feels good and I like it, or it doesn't feel good and I don't like it. As Latwii explains, resolution of the emotional baggage resulting from the resentful interpretation of the catalyst requires the act of forgiveness, but forgiveness is not what most people believe it to be. Traditionally, in the eyes of the resentment holder, a person commits a transgression against the resentment holder by not supporting its identity and therefore not providing the good feelings expected. While still preserving the false identity and its resulting expectations, and in an artificially forced act of compassion and/or benevolence, the injured party is instructed to rise above the failings of the injuring party and offer forgiveness without much or any awareness gain on the part of the resentment holder. The message recipient essentially builds a new wing onto its false identity that reinforces the main identity by expanding and defending it with the thought, I am a better, bigger, or a more erudite person than the message bringer. In the words of Latwii, you gaze too close into the mirror of this illusion and your manifestation within it. Your birthright is to be forgiven, to realize each self-perceived error and to forgive oneself for it and move on. Every experience is a message or catalyst to the message recipient, but not about the messenger, and if the recipient doesn't get the lesson offered in the message, forgiveness isn't sincere and therefore isn't healing. Forgiveness requires a change in the recipient, or in other words, it requires the recipient to become aware of what within itself feels injured or disrespected, and the further amendment of the aspect of the identity that the recipient is clinging to. Invariably, changing the identity in this way requires an incremental surrender of free will intoxication, whether the recipient is aware that this is what is actually being surrendered or not. Consciousness, especially at a third density level, sees things as it is, not as things actually are, and therefore experiences stress when its identity isn't supported. Forgiveness requires self-exploration with the intentional purpose of reaching a heightened degree of self-awareness, which results in the inevitable healing of the distorted perceptions of the false identity. Previously, we explained that the journey through the entirety of third density and the beginning of fourth density is a solo journey, because the awareness potential of consciousness experiencing the density doesn't exceed the perceptual limits of an individualized mind-body-spirit. Because of the various contributing distortions of the archetypical mind, no one has participated in 100% of an individual's experiences except for the individual, and no one has interpreted the experiences precisely as has the experiencer. The limited capacity to experience beyond the perception of a separate and individualized self is the essence of the uniqueness of the identity through which the experiences were interpreted, based solely upon what the experiencer prefers. Again, Latwii's words. Thus you come to a respect and an honoring and a loving and a nurturing of yourself. The key to forgiveness of others is the forgiveness of the self. Release, release, release. Give back to the forces of the universe those energies which are easily absorbed in infinity, and leave them not to pollute your own feelings, your mind, or your heart, but rather let forgiveness flow as a sweet river under the surface of all that you do and say. The purpose of creation is to provide the Creator, the one infinite Creator, with the opportunity to learn of itself by experiencing itself. Consciousness is the one infinite Creator that perceives of itself as separate from the Creator, made possible by the concept of free will, experiencing creation as the Creator, as the subject. The third density consciousness's identity, which all mind-body spirits are destined to create, is simply the result of the free will concept at the third density level of awareness. Because the third and early fourth density mind-body spirit sees things as they are, not as things actually are, forgiveness requires the exploration of the self through increased awareness, which, since consciousness is the creator as the subject, is the creator learning of itself by experiencing itself. Forgiveness requires an increased ability to feel compassion both for the self and others. But to feel compassion requires the surrendering of the authenticity of the identity. Forgiving the self for perceiving others' actions or inactions as transgressions, subsequently surrendering expectations predicated upon the authenticity of the identity, and consequently being able to forgive the self, begins with becoming aware of the associated feelings or emotions. Emotions were employed to interpret the experience judged to be a transgression of the identity, and emotions are the flashing red light that highlights the path to healing. Forgiving others for perceived transgressions comes after forgiving the self, which means the aggrieved party has been successful in getting the lesson that was offered through the experience, and amending the identity through a partial surrender of its authenticity. Every identity is a false identity, no matter how broadly shared the resulting expectations may be. When the identity is incrementally surrendered through awareness, what remains is an increased ability to see things as they really are, which results in a reduced compunction to feel stress. Seeing what really is requires a reduction in the propensity to see other people as separate from the self, an increase of the ability to see other people as extensions of the self, and demonstrating empathy and/or compassion. Again, Latwii's words. When the work of forgiveness of self has been done to the point where you feel that maintenance is that which is necessary rather than complete concentration, then and only then turn to the attempt to forgive others. It is not selfish to do the work upon the self first. It is necessary. It is mandatory. You must bring your own personality and biases into balance, else how can you be the house of the Father? How can that light shine through you if you are lurching about, wasting the energy of love in the distortion of self-immolation? True forgiveness concludes with sincere gratitude for the message bringer for how they have brought the catalyst that has elevated the recipient's consciousness level. Only when the message recipient has been able to surrender its identity sufficiently to feel the changes within themselves as a result of the message is forgiveness complete. Forgiveness is a process that begins with a single catalyst. A single transgression can, and often does, serve as a nucleus for subsequent experiences that can begin a cascade of self-awareness and further healing. Once awareness is awakened and the tool of awareness is begun to be skillfully employed within the self, new experiences that heretofore would have been perceived as significant slights or transgressions will have a less dramatic impact and serve as catalysts for even greater healing and transformation of the remaining identity. Awareness is a very simple but powerful tool to heal the self by surrendering distortions and pointing consciousness towards truth. Truth, of course, is the way things really are, and the more a mind-body spirit is able to surrender the identity and see things as they are, instead of through the distortion of the identity, the less stress experienced. Experiencing transgressions or slights is also evident with expectations established from aspects of an identity garnered through group affiliations, like families, religions, or political groups. People affiliate with groups based upon a comfortable affinity because of shared identity characteristics and expectations, and when the group identity is disrespected, The perceived transgression may feel as intense to the individuals within the group as if the slight were made personally. The group doesn't feel emotions because only the individuals comprising the group can feel the emotions within themselves. But the group does reflect the median consciousness level of the individuals and consequently behaves as a cumulative reflection of the individual's degree of evolution. It isn't uncommon for a transgression of a group expectation to create a more intense response within the members than a message offered specifically to an individual. The reactions from the group may begin small but grow as the more unaware reactive reflexes of the lower consciousness group members pull the median awareness level of the group down to a lower level, causing group members that, as individuals, may be less reactionary. This is classic mob mentality, as the more mature acting members revert to lower consciousness behavior because they surrender their perspective and allow the group perspective to prevail for a period of time. Losing one's perspective invariably results in regret and promotes the need to forgive the self for reverting to a greater degree of unconsciousness, especially for the higher consciousness members of the group. Awareness is always the appropriate tool to avoid self-harming behavior and to heal the unconscious distortions of the self that feel the need to defend a false identity in order to feel good. Michelle Obama's often reiterated quote, "When they go low, we go high," requires the individual to be aware and to employ it to guide and heal the self. Everyone feels emotions because that is how consciousness interprets experiences. But it isn't essential that emotions or emotional baggage be debilitating. Going high necessitates examining the emotions felt, surrendering the part of the identity challenged by the experience, and responding to the transgression in a way that demonstrates the higher perspective. Latwii goes on to say, "Let us say we have done this work and it does come to an end. Not that you do not slip from time to time back into those negative programs which have caused you to be armored against the rest of the world and survive, but that you recognize that you do not need this armor, that you are meant to be vulnerable to circumstances, that you are meant to be an actor upon the social scene. This is the density where you learn to deal with entities in more and more gentle compassion and love. You then can see that although those other entities may not have done this work, at the end of that work, which they will do at some point, they will find their birthright as children of a forgiven nature, children of the one Creator, children of love in which there is no judgment." For consciousness that has chosen to participate in the portion of creation that evolves, which is but a small portion of consciousness participating in creation, the process is the same. Consciousness is intentionally distorted so as to perceive of itself as perceptually as far from the Creator as possible, and then carefully guided back to the perception of unity, where it began. Third density is the most chaotic and the most intense phase of the evolutionary process because consciousness has enough intelligence to create an independent perceiving identity, which potentially causes it great pain and suffering, and, of its own volition, must become sufficiently aware to surrender the very identity it has spent lifetimes engineering in order to move closer to reunification with Source. Consciousness is simply exploring love, but in order to know real love that it likes, it must first learn the aspects of love that it doesn't like. The late comedian Bill Hicks often called life an amusement park ride, and in many respects it is. But if you don't know it's supposed to be fun, it can be terrifying. Learn to forgive by healing the self, and then forgive others by surrendering the false self-identity and its related contrived expectations. Awareness is the tool every aspect of consciousness has to move quickly and painlessly through evolution. But awareness is much like a hammer. It's a simple tool that can be used immediately by everyone, but takes practice to learn to use it well. However, the practice often begins with a number of smashed thumbs. This concludes episode 33 of the Simple Enlightenment podcast, and we thank you for listening. If you are enjoying these presentations, we ask that you share them with family and friends that you believe will find them useful. Also, we encourage you to go to our website at podcastenlightenment.org to download a transcript of this and other episodes. While at the website, we encourage you to make a donation to help us continue to offer this service. Simple Enlightenment is entirely listener-funded, and we rely upon the generosity of listeners like you to keep us going. The website also offers suggested readings, recordings of simple meditations, and much more that you may find helpful, all free of course. Finally, we ask that you take a moment to like and share us on your favorite social media service, and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify because your reviews help other people find us.